that abortion on demand has been the law for so long that it has begun to shape how we see ourselves, how we define human sexuality, how we redefine the purposes of reproduction, how we define liberty. And it has become so woven into the fabric of our nation that if we were to reverse Roe versus Wade, we would tear the fabric of our nation. That's what they're saying. And I began to appreciate for the first time that law just doesn't reflect our moral values, but it begins to shape our moral values. That there is a connection between our moral values and the law that is so real that it begins to shape us and change the way we think. I would submit to you we've just witnessed that in the murder of George Tiller. You see, we intuitively believe that what the law allows must be okay, because if it's not okay, surely the law would prohibit it. But if it's bad, the law ought to prohibit it, and surely if it's prohibited, it must be bad. And when our sense of law and our sense of morality begin to contradict one another, then we have the cruel alternative of either losing our morality or losing our respect for the law. And that played out in front of us on the front pages in the death of Dr. Tiller. After 30 years of abortion on demand, Dr. Tiller had lost his moral sense and saw nothing wrong with partial birth abortion. We have young people here, and I won't describe it, but if you don't know what it is, it's heinous. See, the other side of that is some lose their respect for the law. And if the law is going to allow that, then I need to take the law into my own hands, and so they shoot him. Law is very important. And I began to realize that it has an educative, instructional aspect to it that we Christians need to understand and appreciate, and that if we understand it and if we appreciate that, we cannot not be engaged in law and policy making and politics. And I began to realize that understanding of the influence and the shaping, instructional influence of law and its effect on our morals was a biblical concept, because in Romans it does say, does it not? I would not have known sin but for the law. I would not have known covetousness. It says in Galatians that the law is our tutor to bring us to Christ. You see, as the laws are more or less righteous, we begin to understand what sin is. There may be some in this room who are getting a little uncomfortable maybe with what I'm saying. They're saying, David, we just need to preach the gospel. We just need to get people saved. And yes, we need to preach the gospel, but the whole of the gospel, which I'm going to talk about more in just a moment. And yes, people need to be saved. That is true. But saved to what? But we need to appreciate that if the law indeed has this educative component that begins to shape our moral values over time, then to the extent we ignore the law and what takes place in politics, and we become more unrighteous and more unjust in our laws, we are making the gospel-sharing ground that much harder to plow. Because when people lose their sense of righteousness, where everything is just personal choice, then they don't understand a holy God. And when they lose this sense of justice, they lose any sense of an appreciation of the reverence of someday standing before Him who is most just and holy. We must be involved. We must be engaged. Law is too important to be unconcerned about what happens in Nashville and what happens in Washington. But the Lord began to show me something else. He began to show me just how very real this understanding was, because when I got elected, I thought, I'm going to take an oath to uphold the Constitution. I ought to read it. Sort of like a preacher, ought to read the Bible, I guess, before he preaches it. I thought, I'll read the Constitution. I highly commend it to our legislators. I hope they'd know where to find it. But anyway, as I got to the end, this is what it says. This is an incredible statement. No person who denies the being of God or a future state of rewards and punishments can hold any office in the civil department of this state. If you went to Mike Jennings' law office and you pulled out the green books, the heading for that chapter of the Tennessee Constitution would say, no atheist to hold public office. You see, in 1870, we understood that if the elected official did not understand the importance of the transcendent, that his accountability went beyond the ballot box and what you might know in August or November, then that person was not trustworthy. We didn't want them holding office. Wow. Today it's just the opposite, isn't it? One of the first questions I got asked the day after my election, a little young reporter came in from some television station and he started asking me all these questions. You know, you're the religious right, you're the Bible-thumping wacko, all that kind of stuff. And he asked me this question: can you be a conservative Christian and effectively serve as a politician? Fortunately, I'd read that. And I said, I don't know. Let me ask you this. And when I quoted him that, he looked at me. He said, that's in the Constitution? And I said, yep. He said, okay, well, I guess the interview's over. But you know what began to happen in our culture, really around this time of 1870, is Darwinism was breaking onto the scene. You know, we weren't prepared to defend the truth of in the beginning God, and so we began to retreat. And we said, well, you know, we can't explain all this stuff down here that evolution's trying to explain, so we're going to stuff God in some spiritual box in some supernatural realm, and that way we don't have to worry about it down here. And we're just going to love God and be spiritual. You know, and after a while, God became irrelevant down here. And we began to compartmentalize our lives. The philosophers would call it dualism. And we stuck God up here and the rest of life down here. And since most of the time we're living down here, God becomes even less and less relevant. And we began to separate God from everything else He's created. And so it's not surprising that just a scant 78 years later, the United States Supreme Court, in a religion case, makes this incredible statement. Compare this to 1870. The First Amendment rests on the premise that both religion and government can best work to achieve their lofty aims if each is left free from the other. From if your religion and your government don't intersect, we don't want you, to if they do intersect, we don't want you. They must be kept separate. Keep God in His supernatural spiritual box. Because we got the business of life to live down here, you see. You know what's happened? It's had its educative effect on our society. I saw this poll just recently. It was actually from 2007. George Barna asked the question of Americans. And the question was, what percentage of Americans, he was trying to determine, believe that conservative Christians are a major or minor problem facing America today? How many people think that I am a minor, if not a major problem? I mean, we got terrorism, we got all these other things, the economy collapsing, but is Fowler a problem? Now, I must confess, in recent days, when I learned that evangelical political advocates are indeed terrorists in the eyes of some in Washington, I thought, well, maybe we are a minor problem or a major problem. But you know what's interesting? The 16 to 29-year-old group, the non-Christian Mosaic Busters, 62% of them said, yep, you're a minor, if not a major problem facing our country. Incredible. You know what was scarier? You know what told me that the church had been taken captive by the philosophies of men like that of the Supreme Court? Was that 47% of the born-again 16 to 29-year-olds agree. Half of the people in your youth group, if they are representative of American Christian people, born again, not just self-proclaimed, but answered the questions about Jesus is the only way to heaven and the Bible's true, that's what they had to answer to be classified as born again, believe we're a problem. And the weight of the educative, instructional power and impact and force of law really came home to me. As Christians, we cannot not care. But I would submit that there is an even more fundamental and more compelling reason why we should be engaged in our government and in politics. Can't see that too well, I'm sorry. But in Colossians, he basically echoes what begins at the beginning. Within the beginning is God. And in Colossians, Paul says, for by him all things were created. And they hold together. But in between the all things were created and in him they hold together is the statement whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. It's what led Paul to say in Romans chapter 13 when discussing the government and the ruler and the magistrate to say there is no authority except from God. And those which exist are established by God. And I realized that if indeed he has created all things, he has created government. He has authorized in the form of his creation for the unfolding of civil government. And what God creates, the book says, is good. It may be fallen. Men in their fallenness may have perverted it from its good, godly intentions. But what God creates is good. And the whole of this book screams out to us that God does not abandon the work of his hands. He cares about everything that he's created. And he desires to reconcile all things back to himself. And all things, I think, means all things, which includes government. And trust me, from having been on the inside, there is much to be redeemed. Much to be reconciled. Back to God's intention for government. Government is really just a reflection of the nature and character of God who governs and establishes order. How can government be a bad thing? It can be used by bad. It can be perverted into doing bad things. But God calls us to redeem it, to reconcile it back to his good purposes. But the other thing is it's very clear that power belongs to God. In Romans 13 it says there is no authority apart from God. If you look in the original Greek, the expression no authority means literally translated no authority. Not some, most, more often than not, authority belongs to God. It is his. I mean, we may be given the freedom to rearrange how that authority gets exercised in various forms of government, but power belongs to him. It reminds me of the story I recently heard of the scientist who said to God, well, we figured out how to create life. We don't need you anymore. And God said, okay, great. Have at it. And the scientist bends over and he grabs some of the dust of the earth. And God says, whoa, 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 whoa. Make your own dust. See, we don't create power. Everything comes from God. Everything comes from God. Power is his.